Canada's diplomatic and economic stance toward the United States has changed significantly after President Donald Trump was re-elected in November 2024. Concern has been raised in Canada's corporate and political communities by the reinstatement of harsh U.S. trade policies, particularly a 10% tariff on energy exports and a 25% tax on a wide range of Canadian imports. Trump's divisive remarks that Canada might one day become the 51st state, which are generally regarded as provocative and insulting of Canadian sovereignty, exacerbated the tension. Since then, Canada has increased its exports to nations outside of the U.S., but the crude oil industry is still closely linked to the U.S. market. But according to a June 2nd meeting of the Canadian government, the country has now started to diversify its oil exports away from the United States. Let's first examine the normal operation of the oil trade between the United States and Canada, before delving into this new development. The benchmark heavy crude for Canada, Western Canadian Select, is currently trading at about $52.24 per barrel as of early June 2025, while West Texas Intermediate is trading at about $60.79 per barrel. The price difference as a result is almost $8.55 per barrel. The heavier grade of WCS and transportation limitations are two reasons for this pricing difference. By importing Canadian oil at a discount and occasionally reselling it at market prices, the U.S. takes advantage of this discount. According to estimates, this practice brings in about $19 billion for the United States each year. The U.S. market is a major focus of Canada's oil export infrastructure. By mid-2024, Canada's oil exports to the U.S. will have increased from 3.8 million barrels per day in 2023 to an average of 4.3 million barrels per day by mid-2024, making up about 60% of total U.S. crude imports. These barrels are mostly transported via pipeline networks, including the Trans Mountain System and Enbridge's main line. 97% of Canada's crude oil exports, or around 3.8 million barrels per day, were shipped to refineries in the United States in 2023, with a total value of over $130 billion. Diversifying export destinations has been fraught with challenges. Due to regulatory obstacles, environmental concerns, and resistance from indigenous populations, projects such as the Energy East and Northern Gateway pipelines, which sought to offer access to eastern and western tidewater ports, respectively, were shelved. Greater access to Asian markets is now possible thanks to the Trans Mountain Extension project, which was completed in May 2024 and has expanded capacity to Canada's Pacific coast, from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000 barrels per day. The TMX quadrupled the pipeline's capacity. The TMX's capacity is constrained, though, and additional growth will encounter the same difficulties that beset earlier initiatives. The United States is Canada's top export destination for natural gas, in addition to oil. In 2023, the average amount of natural gas exported by pipeline from Canada to the United States was 5.2 billion cubic feet per day, or 100% of Canada's total natural gas exports. In the first half of 2024, this amount increased to 5.4 billion cubic feet per day, mostly going to the western and mid-continent regions. Exports of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, from Canada to the U.S. are still in their infancy. About 0.04 of a billion cubic feet are exported daily by Tilbury LNG. In the meantime, LNG Canada started cooling down in March 2025 and intends to ship its first shipment by the middle of 2025, with a 14 million ton annual capacity. Once operational, this will progressively lower pipeline natural gas volumes to the U.S. Alberta supplies British Columbia with natural gas, which is then transported south via the BC. With a daily capacity of roughly 1.9 billion cubic feet, the Washington connection serves the Pacific Northwest. In order to facilitate the export of gas and oil to markets outside of the U.S., Canada is currently aggressively supporting the construction of additional pipelines and other infrastructure. Let's talk about the Canadian government's most recent declaration. The premiers of Canada's 10 provinces met with Prime Minister Mark Carney in Saskatoon on June 2nd. In order to lessen Canada's excessive reliance on the U.S. as an export market, the main objective was to investigate methods of expediting the approval process for significant infrastructure and resource projects, especially in the mining and energy industries. Carney began by pointing out that it may take up to 10 years to get federal permission for major mining or energy projects under present standards. By identifying certain projects as being of national significance, he put up a framework that would reduce that time frame to no more than 2 years. The goal is to create the assurance, stability, and drive that builders require in order to spur massive investment and turn Canada into a global energy powerhouse. In his concluding remarks, he reiterated his conviction that quicker and more transparent decision-making will boost GDP growth and assist Canada in preparing its economy for future trade challenges from the United States. Carney mentioned a number of national projects as possible candidates for fast-tracking, including the Grays Bay Road and port in Nunavut, a planned route that would link southern Canada with the Arctic Ocean and create pathways for the export of minerals. The development of Ontario's Ring of Fire, a significant chromite and nickel mining area in the north, has been halted by infrastructure deficiencies and regulatory obstacles. While acknowledging that Canada currently only has one such conduit, the Trans Mountain, which transports up to 900,000 barrels per day to the Pacific, the Pathways Alliance in Alberta, a group of oil sands producers, is planning a $20 billion carbon capture and storage network to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from extraction and new pipelines to tidewater. Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta, whose province generates almost 70% of Canada's oil, offered what she called a grand bargain. She projected that a privately funded pipeline that transported 1 million barrels of crude oil per day to northwest British Columbia might bring in $20 billion a year. To support initiatives like the Pathways Alliance, Alberta's oil sands businesses would agree to invest $10 to $20 billion in technology that absorb or offset carbon dioxide emissions. After the discussion, Smith stated, "I'm encouraged by the immediate change of tone that we've seen from recent months. We haven't heard that language in a while when we hear the Prime Minister talking about being an energy superpower." Carney gave Smith's outline a good response. In reference to the grand bargain, he said, "I agree with her, but emphasized that any new pipeline must transport decarbonized barrels of oil within the larger framework of national interest." Ontario Premier Doug Ford called the meeting the best in a decade and praised Carney's drive for national-scale projects, but he admitted that no firm promises had been made. BC Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma reiterated her province's long-standing opposition to any new bitumen pipeline through British Columbia, saying that there is no proponent currently for such a project and that the government's focus should remain on shovel-ready initiatives. "We have differences of opinion with Alberta on whether a new pipeline is needed," Ford joked, comparing Carney's departing briefcase of proposals to a Santa Claus sled loaded with items for review over the summer. Despite the fact that the port at Churchill is icebound for much of the year, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew suggested that a route to Hudson Bay might eventually become the most viable course toward hitting international tidewaters. He stressed that such a corridor would require significant private sector investment, as well as creativity and problem-solving. She said, highlighting that BC's priorities include critical minerals infrastructure and renewable energy transmission. In order to help stabilize energy prices in the Maritimes, the premiers of Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick emphasized the need for better natural gas and electricity interconnectors with the rest of Canada. Before we get into the specifics of this news item, we would like to ask that you click the like button, which tells the algorithm that this conversation is important. You can also leave a comment to continue the discussion, regardless of whether you agree, disagree, or have a different opinion. Please subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already. Thank you for participating. Let's continue. A number of advocacy groups and indigenous leaders cautioned that expediting approvals could compromise their right to meaningful consultation and possibly result in legal challenges. Carney acknowledged these concerns, saying that respecting indigenous rights is non-negotiable, and promised that any designation of national interest would still require robust consultation processes. Environmental groups were equally cautious, emphasizing that any attempt to limit our input on projects that cross our traditional territories will be met with resistance, according to a spokesperson for the Assembly of First Nations. "We cannot abandon our climate targets in the process," said an Environmental Defense Canada representative, adding that reducing Canada's dependence on the U.S. market is understandable, but we need to decarbonize oil production so that any new exports are aligned with Canada's climate commitments. The representative urged Carney to explicitly tie approvals to verifiable emissions reductions. Carney responded by citing the Pathways Alliance as an example. In addition to resource corridors, premiers talked about removing interprovincial trade barriers. Carney said that removing internal trade barriers is just as important as opening new external markets, arguing that streamlined trade between provinces could lead to job creation and economic diversification. Doug Ford of Ontario added that we must make sure that energy and goods can move from coast to coast without provincial barriers, and Legault of Quebec emphasized the significance of bilingual regulatory alignment. By late summer, Carney promised to draft criteria for national interest designations and provide a follow-up framework. By mid-July, Ottawa will distribute guidelines defining which projects are eligible and set up a rapid review office, which will be operational by early August and tasked with coordinating federal, provincial, and Indigenous reviews within a 24-month period. Deadlines for provincial submissions. By July 15th, territorial leaders have the same deadline for northern proposals, and each province is required to suggest a maximum of 3 projects. Interim check-in Carney will meet again in Ottawa in late September to review progress on project nominations and guidelines, following U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement of steel tariffs doubled to 50%, which has accelerated Carney's efforts to diversify export routes. The Prime Minister said after meeting with provincial leaders on Monday that it is absolutely in our interest to decarbonize Canada's oil industry and explore a new route for crude exports that avoids reliance on the U.S., which already imports about 4 million barrels per day from its neighbor to the north. "We cannot allow external shocks to dictate Canadian prosperity," he said, referring to impending U.S. trade barriers. What's next? Mark Carney has said he is open to the idea of building a new pipeline to transport more Canadian oil overseas, but only if it is accompanied by significant green investments aimed at reducing the sector's environmental impact. In order to facilitate resource exports, he said, there was agreement at the table to develop both western and northern trade corridors, including support for an oil pipeline to reach Tidewater. Currently, Canada only has one pipeline, Trans Mountain, which can transport oil to ocean tankers. It was recently expanded to handle approximately 900,000 barrels per day. But there are barriers to building another conduit. BC Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma stated that the government of British Columbia disagrees with Alberta about whether a new pipeline is necessary through its territory, and any new route would probably cross lands owned by Indigenous First Nations, some of whom may oppose the plan and challenge it in court. In a first step toward delivering on Carney's promise to reduce Canada's heavy reliance on the U.S. market by bolstering the domestic economy and developing new trading partners, All 13 provincial and territorial premiers submitted proposals for projects, from ports to power lines to mines, that they hope will be identified as having national significance, making them eligible for fast-tracked approval under a process Carney promised. Carney stressed that Canada still seeks to ease trade frictions with U.S. President Donald Trump, but he also stressed the need to remove internal trade barriers and pursue large-scale national infrastructure projects in order to take matters very much into our own hands. The main coast-to-tidewater oil conduit in Canada is the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which runs approximately 1,150 km from the Edmonton Tank Farm in Strathcona County, Alberta, to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, British Columbia, just outside of Vancouver. Originally put into service in 1953 as a single product line carrying crude oil, Trans Mountain has expanded over the years to accommodate refined products as well. This analysis is necessary to understand why Canada is unable to export larger volumes of its crude oil overseas. As Canada sought to diversify its export markets beyond the United States, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project was conceived to nearly triple the pipeline's capacity. By the mid-1980s, it was routinely transporting gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel from Edmonton to Kamloops, and by 1993, it had expanded its multi-product service all the way to Vancouver. In 2018, ownership passed from Kinder Morgan to the Canadian government, and since 2022, it has been run by Trans Mountain Corporation, a federally owned Crown corporation. The federal cabinet approved a plan in 2019 to build approximately 987 kilometers of new 36-inch pipe along the existing right-of-way between Hinton, Alberta, and Burnaby. The expansion included major upgrades to the Westridge terminal to accommodate Aframax and Panamax-class tankers, as well as the construction of new pump stations, including the Wolf facility near Knighton Junction, Alberta, and the Chapel Station near Pyramid Creek Falls in British Columbia. The expanded line officially entered service in June 2024, and its throughput increased from its initial capacity of approximately 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000 barrels per day, with actual volumes in mid-2025 averaging between 750,000 and 800,000 barrels per day. With a direct connection to Pacific Tidewater, the pipeline opens Asia-bound opportunities in nations like Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, and India. Before the expansion, over 95% of Canadian oil exports went south to U.S. markets, so the stakes for Trans Mountain's economy are high. In addition to becoming fully Crown-owned following a $4.5 billion Canadian dollar purchase in 2018, Trans Mountain now contributes its earnings toward the national treasury, helping to pay down federal debt over time. Despite these economic benefits, Trans Mountain's route passes through sensitive coastal ecosystems, waterways like the Fraser River Delta, and rugged mountain terrain, areas known for both rich biodiversity and extensive aquaculture activity. Economists estimate that the increased volumes could generate between $3 billion and $4 billion in annual toll revenue, depending on shipper contracts and global commodity prices. In order to mitigate these environmental risks, Trans Mountain Corporation has a federally mandated spill response plan that works closely with organizations such as Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard. Additionally, over 130 Indigenous groups are involved in the project through contracts and benefit-sharing agreements, offering services from construction support to environmental monitoring, with the goal of ensuring that Indigenous communities have a say in protecting their traditional lands and share in the economic benefits. The Enbridge Canadian Main Line, which begins at the Hardisty Terminal in Alberta and travels up to 3 million barrels per day of crude and natural gas liquids to locations like Brandon, Manitoba Sarnia, Ontario, and Montreal's oil terminal, is vital for transporting Western Canadian oil to Eastern Canadian refineries and then into American markets. In addition to Trans Mountain, Canada's oil export network depends heavily on the Enbridge Canadian Mainline, which primarily runs west to east across the Prairie Provinces and Ontario, before connecting to U.S. refineries in the Midwest. Canada is one of the world's largest oil producers, but its ability to export crude oil outside of the United States has historically been constrained by infrastructure. Recent developments, especially the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or TMX, have started to change this dynamic, increasing Canada's capacity to reach international markets. Gradual upgrades, like the replacement of Line 3 and the Alberta Clipper, also known as Line 67, have increased its capacity from roughly 2.1 million barrels per day in 2010 to nearly 3 million by 2020. About 90% of Canada's crude oil exports, or about 4 million barrels per day, were historically sent to the United States, mainly because of the vast north-south pipeline infrastructure that connected Canadian oil fields to U.S. refineries. Although the TMX has created new opportunities for Canadian oil exports, further diversification may necessitate additional infrastructure developments. As of late 2024, Canada produced about 5.4 million barrels of crude oil per day, with projections indicating an increase to 5.6 million barrels per day by the end of 2025. In order to wrap up the video, let's also discuss Canada's LNG exports to nations outside of the United States. Proposals for new pipelines or expansions, such as increasing TMX's capacity by an additional $200,000 to 300,000 barrels per day, are being considered. However, these projects face obstacles, such as regulatory approvals, environmental concerns, and financial viability. Located on Ridley Island near Kitimat, British Columbia, the LNG Canada project is a joint venture led by Shell, 40%, and Petronas, 25%, PetroChina, 15%, Mitsubishi, 15%, and Korea Gas Corporation, 5%. Its two-train design will provide an initial export capacity of 14 MTPA, or approximately 1.84 BCFD of LNG, delivered to global customers via ice-class carriers, capable of navigating the Pacific trade routes. By the time it reaches its full phase DAN capacity, by mid-2025, LNG Canada will enable the entry of Canadian natural gas into Asia's major LNG importing regions, especially Japan, South Korea, and increasingly China, where Japanese utilities Toho Gas and Tokyo Gas have already secured long-term purchase agreements for up to 15 and 13 years, respectively. Once the facility starts exporting, Canada will become a major global LNG supplier, ending its historical reliance on U.S. pipeline demand and opening the opportunity to contract volumes at prevailing global spot and long-term prices, which have frequently exceeded US $10 per MMBtu in Asia under peak demand conditions. After Phase 1, LNG Canada's shareholders are assessing Phase 2, which would double capacity to 28 MTPA, 3.6 BCFD, subject to a positive final investment decision, or FID, expected in late 2025. Coastal GasLink reached full commercial operation in late 2023 and provides up to 2.1 BCFD of natural gas, ensuring LNG Canada has unfettered access to high-quality Montney gas for liquefaction. With a capacity of 2.1 MTPA, or roughly 0.28 BCFD, Woodfibre LNG, located near Squamish, British Columbia, is the second major project under construction and is expected to begin operations in 2027. Developed by Woodfibre LNG Limited, a partnership between Pacific Energy Corporation and heavily supported by the Asian conglomerate Sumitomo, Woodfibre's 0.28 BCFD of LNG will be produced by expanding the existing Eagle Mountain Woodfibre gas pipeline to convey Montigny gas to its Squamish liquefaction plant. If approved, Phase 2 would build on economies of scale already established and further solidify Canada as a diversified LNG supplier, comparable to major exporters like Australia and Qatar. Woodfibre LNG, located near Squamish, British Columbia, is the second major project under construction. It is expected to begin operations in 2027 with a capacity of 2.1 MTPA, or roughly 0.28 BCFD. Developed by Woodfibre LNG Limited, a partnership between Pacific Energy Corporation and significantly backed by the Asian conglomerate Sumitomo, Woodfibre's 0.28 BCFD of LNG will be produced by expanding the existing Eagle Mountain Woodfibre gas pipeline to convey Montigny gas to its Squamish liquefaction plant. The project has obtained marine export permits and all environmental approvals, and it has benefited from community support and commitments to minimize greenhouse gas emissions through electric motor-driven liquefaction units powered by clean hydroelectricity from the BC grid. Thanks to community support and pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions using clean hydroelectricity from the BC grid to power electric motor-driven liquefaction units, the project has obtained marine export permits and all environmental approvals. Thank you for watching. We are an independent channel and do not have corporate support. Thank you so much for being a part of our community. If you thought this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Your support is what keeps us going. Watch the next video that appears on your screen. We chose it especially for you.